Season 4 of the Overwatch League had its fair share of entertaining matches. From reverse sweeps to huge tournament upsets, it basically had a little bit of everything, but a certain number of them definitely do stand out from the rest of the pack. And those are the matches that I'm here to talk about with you in this video. In no specific order, here's my top 5 matches of Overwatch League Season 4. Number 5. The San Francisco Shock vs Houston Outlaws Week 1. Now this was one heck of a way to kick off a new year. A vast majority of fans expected this to be a somewhat easy win for the San Francisco Shock, but what we got instead was one of the most intense matches of the entire year. Based on scrim results, it was clear that both teams were strong at the rush composition, and we truly saw that on display with how intense some of the fights were. This one had everything you'd ever want in a game. An upset, a near reverse sweep, and so many twists and turns. Who would have expected the Shock to go down 2-0 right off the rip? And the fashion in which they lost those maps was pretty wild too, because they showed miscue after miscue in the first half of that game. They technically had a chance to even up the series on Blizzard World, but they only managed to force a tie. But of course, in typical Shock fashion, they rallied back. The second half of that game was when they truly came alive. They weren't blowing Houston out of the water every map, but they certainly were outplaying them at all of the critical moments. Temple of Anubis was up for grabs, but they found a way to get it done. This map was a big standout moment, not just for the Shock and their turnaround, but also what Happy did on point A of that attack. It was filthy. I, like many of you, could probably vividly remember still just losing our minds as Happy blew that point wide open by killing everything in sight on Hanzo. But even with those crazy individual heroics, the Shock came up clutch with the superior teamwork to keep the series alive. And it was honestly the turning point where the momentum started to go in their favor because Oasis definitely was in their control. Big time shout out goes to Nero and Striker for pulling off that floating cowboy strategy, by the way. That was sick. That was the highlight of the map. Anyway, it's crazy to think that this game went from all Outlaws to all Shock in basically an hour worth of time. By the time we reached Havana and that stout defense the Shock pulled off, it looked like the game was over. San Fran put a vice grip on the Outlaws with that double shield comp, and I thought for sure the game was done. But of course, this game wouldn't be nearly as special if that was the case, now would it? In the most dramatic fashion possible, it comes down to the very last fight, where Chengdu cemented his legacy in Overwatch League history with the earthshatter that was heard around the world. I don't know about you, but I still vividly remember that sequence. It starts off looking really bad for Chengdu and the Outlaws, as his HP goes down by half basically, and Crimzo has to burn Immortality Field, but then the Shock lose sight of him for some reason, and Chengdu pulls off the sneaky shatter of the century. He delivered to create one of the biggest game-saving plays of the year. The result was a 7-map thriller in favor of the Outlaws. How do we go from this being the Outlaws game to win, then to the Shock, then back to the Outlaws again? I really appreciate the back and forth, and the surprise outcome really was the cherry on top. What an awesome match. Number 4. LA Gladiators vs Chengdu Hunters Countdown Cup Finals. If you're looking for chaos, look no further. This tournament finale will go down for the ages as yet another failed comeback that kept us on the edge of our seats. During this point in time, both franchises were reaching the peak of their powers. Leave, Shu, Kevster, they were all playing some top-notch Overwatch, so you kind of had the feeling that a meeting between these two would be special. What I love about this game is it basically was all over the place in typical Chengdu fashion. There were close maps, not so close maps, and some wild individual plays from some very talented individuals. It was a real chess match. Any team is going to be in that situation when they enter the Chengdu zone, and I think the Glads learned that the hard way. They had every right to win that series in 5 maps, but the Hunters just developed this reputation over time as becoming this second half team, if you will, and they showed that yet again in this championship game. Part of what made the Hunters so terrifying was that Pharah Tracer comp, but usually they did look pretty beatable if you could keep it in check. So when the Gladiators showed they had a good game plan to at least kind of contain it, Chengdu had no choice but to adapt. They start breaking out the curveballs. We see an increase in Zen play. Gaga plays a bit more Orisa and Monkey. Leaf and Jinmu start throwing out some things to slow down Kevster's Tracer. You really have to appreciate those mid-game adjustments. That's again why I kind of saw this as a chess match. Chengdu had their philosophy going into that series, but realized that it might not work just because the Glads seemed to have a decent read on them. They had to make changes if there was going to be any sort of hope of getting back into the game, and it's safe to say they figured something out, because King's Row and Ilios were crazy. And and while their late game rally just fell short, I can appreciate that they didn't just lay down and take it. They went down fighting while also confusing their opposition in any way they could. I mean, even Havana seemed pretty winnable when the Glads failed to push the payload all the way. The Hunters simply failed to execute on attack, they just couldn't do enough. But again, it's really not that big of a deal because the Gladiators were playing out of their minds. There's not much you can do in that situation. That 3K that Shu had to stop Chengdu from capping point B was insane. It was one of the most clutch plays on Baptiste of all time. And when it wasn't Shu, it was either Kevster or Birdring. It was non-stop. Being able to clutch up in such an important game is how legends are born. When you choke a lead like that, sometimes it can feel like there's no stopping it. Only the best will be able to wake up, shake it off, and continue playing at the highest level possible. That's part of what made this game so amazing for both sides. The mental fortitude was very, very underrated, and you're combining that with some very flashy plays out of both sides. I talked about the Glad's DPS and Shu, but you also have to give credit to Leave and Jinmu and Gaga for stepping up. People are going to look back fondly at the sheer number of stars constantly trying to outdo one another in this one. This game was great live, and I firmly believe it will age very nicely as we head towards a new chapter in the world of Overwatch. Number 3. The Atlanta Reign versus Dallas Fuel Summer Showdown Qualifiers. This rivalry was among one of the best of 2021. What kind of list would this be if I didn't at least include one of their matches? These two played quite a few epic games, so the choice was not easy. In fact, I nearly went with their matchup in the Summer Showdown loser semis, but I ultimately decided that the qualifier match was better overall. There were more maps in this one that just felt more interesting. This game always had me getting out of my seat. It all starts with a Nepal match that was just so intense, it really set the tone for the series. All 3 rounds came down to the last fight, which isn't something that usually happens on Control. Something I found so appealing about that map, and the series in general for that matter, is that we often saw these two clash on identical compositions. Anytime one side would try and go a bit out of the box with their rush comp with like a Doomfist or something along those lines, the other would come back with one of their own. It was the ultimate ego battle of sorts. Pelican and Sparkle were trading flashy plays, while Gator and Fearless took turns being the hero with massive earth shatters. The first map really set the tone for the rest of the series, like I was saying. Even if every map wasn't going to be this close, it was clear that Atlanta were going to put up one heck of a fight this time. It was pretty insane the way these two traded blow after blow after blow. Whenever it looked like Dallas had the advantage, Atlanta would come up huge. Think about Route 66. What Atlanta did on that map was stunning. I didn't think it was possible, maybe aside from like the Dragons, for anybody to full-on counter and dominate the Dallas dive comp. Atlanta read them like a book. The readiness and the ability to adjust was inspiring. They didn't just stop Dallas on this map, they crushed them. The Atlanta anti-dive made Fearless useless. That bunched up deathball comp proved to be a real thorn in their sides. Finishing Route 66 with over 3 minutes in the time bank is rare to say the least. It's hard enough to finish this map, let alone have multiple minutes in the bank. That crazy attack caught Dallas completely off guard as they scrambled to change their plan mid-map, but at that point the damage had already been done and the map was all but over. It served as a serious wake-up call to Dallas. They were not going to be able to get away with running anything they wanted to as they would with any ordinary opponent. The Reign were forcing them to play their game. It's the mind games, man, I'm telling you. Atlanta essentially called them out. The only way you're going to beat us is by outplaying us on our own terms. And that's when we saw Dallas display true greatness. They went out there and they adjusted. They showed that they're flexible and capable of beating people no matter what the situation may be. What Dallas pulled off on Anubis was so unexpected. To full hold Atlanta in a full-on rush mirror after getting manhandled one map prior is unreal. That's some ridiculous short-term memory. But again, that's what made Dallas so great in Season 4. But it's also what made Atlanta great too, because they went out and basically did the same thing as they showed their short-term memory on Eichenwald. I recall this map very well still. It was totally off the rails. If one fight goes differently, Dallas might take that map instead. The teamwork and finding those small ways to gain the edge made this map so entertaining. I mean, Dallas were knocking on the door of Atlanta's spawn on point C for crying out loud. The Fuel nearly pushed that payload in with time left on the board, and if that happened, that series might have been over right there and then. And what about when Pelican thought he was being cheeky by hiding behind enemy lines to get off a sneaky blizzard just to have Hanbin pull off one of the craziest diva eats of the year? The mind games were out of this world. That was definitely one of my favorite individual maps. And what really topped it off for me was the fact that Atlanta managed to extend the series when it was all said and done, even after all of the chaos. And while Map 5 wasn't super exciting, the series had already established itself at that point. The final result did not matter. The game had two star-studded rosters clashing in an epic back-and-forth series. These two wailed on each other like it was some sort of 12-round boxing match. It's a series and rivalry that we'll always remember when looking back at previous seasons. Number 2, the LA Gladiators versus San Francisco Shock Countdown Cup Knockouts. Yeah, this one was sick. Not sure how else to explain it. Just in terms of getting the adrenaline pumping, this tops the list. I don't support either team and yet still felt that way throughout the entire thing. If you can feel that invested in a game, even if you don't care for either team competing, it's gotta be an exceptional showcase. What truly made this one so exciting was the stakes. Both of these teams had been denied a trip to Hawaii 3 straight times, which does not bode well when considering their preseason expectations. This was the final opportunity for the both of them, but only one could make it. Emotions were running high for both teams during this one, and even though it's not the playoffs or anything, this is still something you want to be a part of. It's important for your confidence. It serves as a great way to prove yourself, but also a way to potentially improve your position in the overall standings, and when you fail to make it so many times in a row, you tend to go all out, especially when you realize that it's now or never. Every single participant played their hearts out, and I have zero doubts about that. All you really have to do is look at the raw emotion put on display after that final map. It's the highest intensity non-tournament match you'll come across. This game was filled with epic battles and huge heroics, and if that wasn't enough, there were some iconic moments. Like I said before, the end of this game was bonkers. Just watching how much it meant to the players on the side of LA put a smile on my face. But that's far from the only thing that's memorable. For one, it was the classic back and forth affair. That's the best type of game in my opinion. Furthermore, this game's individual pop-offs gives me chills. There's just so many to recount. There's the obvious one with Shu playing like a madman on Havana, but also on the side of the Glads is Birdring's filthy double doink on Hanamura, or just all the crazy plays made by Kevster. Choi's 3K bomb on Oasis was pretty sick as well though. Sometimes we forget about the efforts of the losing teams, which honestly is a shame, because Choi played like his life depended on it during that round on Oasis. His team did lose the game, yeah, but you gotta respect the effort and the determination not to lose. I suppose it's to be expected from somebody like Choi though. He's a multi-time champion, it's in his DNA. So many incredible moments to recount from two rosters that were tired of getting called out, and when it was all said and done, we probably had the most exciting finish possible thanks to Havana. That in itself felt like the final map of the game even though it wasn't. The fate of that series essentially came down to that final fight of Havana. Talk about dramatic, right? This is one you gotta feel invested in, no doubt about it. And I mean, aside from Hanamura, I think the series was just competitive in general, you know? I think maps 2 and 3 saw the Glads maybe trying to shake off some nerves, but that kind of thing makes it even more special since they pulled it off anyway. They were feeling the pressure, but found a way to overcome it ultimately. Excellent game with a perfect ending. Now we're on to the final spot. The number 1 spot on this list belongs to none other than the Shanghai Dragons versus Dallas Fuel June Joust Finals. This match showed exactly why these two had the perfect rivalry. They always pushed each other to their absolute limits, and this game is prime evidence. After Dallas completely destroyed them on day 1 of the same tournament, it seemed like the result of this game would be pretty one-sided, and it seemed very predictable, if you will. We all knew that Shanghai were capable, but nobody seemed to have the answer for the Fuel at the time, and if we're being honest with ourselves, it looked like the trend was likely set to continue at first because Dallas continuously found the upper hand in the first couple of maps. Dallas seemed to be the ones who wanted it more as they were the ones clutching up in the map-defining moments. The Fuel were playing so proactively at the time. They were constantly down the throats of their opposition. They never wasted any time. The pressure never ceased to stop. What can you really do when Fearless is so enabled on Winston, and how on earth do you even come close to replicating the success of Fielder when he's getting ultimates on Moira like every 30 seconds? Anytime the Dragons ever seemed to be winning fights, it turned out of their favor in an instant. Shanghai were doing everything they could. They knew they couldn't do the full-on mirror match with Dallas, but every counter they were trying was getting shut down at first. And I'd say that Volskaya Industries put an emphasis on that. To give up a 4-minute time bank then get full held in the same map is as brutal as it gets. But it's funny, the beatdown seemed to be just what they needed to figure something out. At the time, many of us didn't realize it, but this series started to take a turn because of that map. After getting beat down over and over again, the Dragons began to adjust. Dallas were still mainly in control, but Shanghai were figuring stuff out along the way. They were showing improvement with every single fight. Numbani went their way, and while Rialto was lost, it was a close game. Fans across the world were witnessing the Dragons figure out their rivals in real time. They didn't feel like a struggling team trying to find their way anymore. All of a sudden, this was a real match. The battle on Rialto could have gone either way. And for me personally, Rialto was a real highlight of this game because for one, it went into extra rounds, which is insane because that map is really hard to finish, but also just some of the actual plays that happened during the map itself. That 5k bomb by Void was ridiculous. Recently, I watched the play again, and I realized just how epic the coordination was. Originally, I assumed that Void kind of just threw up a prayer and got lucky, but there's actually way more to it in this sequence. First off, Fate quietly booped both Sparkle and Jexay back into line of sight of the self-destruct. Sparkle and Jexay made it to cover, but if you watch very carefully, you'll see Fate get a sneaky grapple off to push them right back out into the explosion, as it happened too. Like, the timing could not have been any more perfect. Any later on the execution, and I think that both Dallas players might have survived that. But there's even more to it than that, because Fielder, he had a small chance of surviving as well, just because he was trying to hide inside the bubble placed down by Fearless, but Void as Pilot Diva, I believe, broke the bubble right at the very last moment. Everything was so perfectly timed with this play, which honestly gives me even more of a reason to appreciate it. Getting back into the game as a whole now, the Dragons now had their backs against the wall after losing Rialto and going down 3-1 in the series. They even lost the first round of Busan too, which meant that they were moments away from potential elimination. And that's yet another reason to appreciate this series in my opinion. The Dragons had little margin for error. When the lights were at their brightest, they delivered big time. Both Busan and Eichenwald were so extremely close. The field pushed them so hard. There were so many moments where it looked like the series was all but over, but the Dragons, they just would not go down. And it all starts basically with Lip and Fleta because they woke up the entire team with pop-off after pop-off on downtown. It gave the team just enough energy to keep on going because that final round of Mecha Base was where they really needed that extra push. It came down to a 99-99 overtime push to finally get the point back on Mecha Base from Dallas to just barely keep the series alive. And again, the stress continued into Eichenwald. It was definitely not an easy thing from there on out still. Point B and C saw Shanghai clutch up in overtime scenarios on their own attack as they did everything in their power to keep hope alive. The fact that they always kept on managing to barely hold on and move forward is some very inspiring stuff. It was these defining moments where they finally began to break through. They got under the enemy's skin after so much trial and error over multiple matches. You could tell that Dallas were starting to panic a bit towards the end of Eichenwald as they swapped off of Winston. They desperately wanted to slow down Fate with a ball of their own. And that is when the Dragons knew that they finally had some sort of advantage going for themselves. They knew very well that Dallas did not have a chance of matching them on Wrecking Ball. This was the moment they were waiting for. Getting into the heads of those guys was all they needed to flip this series on its head. Once they won Eichenwald, the momentum truly had gone in their favor because they closed out Junkertown like champions. After a somewhat decent attack by Shanghai, Dallas struggled mightily to match them, and just when it looked like they maybe had a chance to stop the bleeding by going up a couple of picks, we had the pleasure of witnessing one of the biggest clutches when disadvantaged in league history as Lip goes on to kill 5 in the championship ceiling fight. What a crazy end to a match. It truly was the exclamation point to a masterpiece game. The Shanghai Dragons pulled off something magical on that night. This was no ordinary win. They showcased the ultimate resilience. The mental fortitude to keep pushing even when you've been beaten and battered is so admirable. That never give up mentality is the very definition of what I consider to be greatness. And how about what they showed from a teamwork perspective? Instead of getting down in the dumps over a team that was hard to solve, they kept their heads up and actively looked for a way to solve the problem. They constantly adjusted and adapted in order to find a solution, and that's a life lesson that you can take with you no matter what you're doing, even if it's not Overwatch. The Dragons showed you what you can accomplish when you really think about stuff and when you play as a team. Hear that, Overwatch fans? Sometimes good things can happen when you play as a team, forehead. Obviously, there were some great individual heroics to help along the way, but some people do not realize how excellent their teamwork and communication was to make this happen. The team constantly played around Fate's wrecking ball. He did such a great job of setting up Void and his DPS. The man truly played out of his mind. A very inspiring performance, to say the least. He was doing everything. He found kills. He made big boops and pile drives happen. He was body blocking. The proactiveness and that keep your head up mentality is just amazing. The tears of joy on Fate's face after pulling off the comeback holds a very special place in my heart. He earned that win. He played his hardest, and he had to endure a lot a couple of years prior to joining Shanghai. That's an iconic moment that I, and many of you, will likely look back on fondly for years to come. But in general, when you think back to Season 4, this is one of the classics that you'll likely remember first. Two teams that were originally cursed met each other in a really good game. From 2018 misery to 2021 title contenders. What a transformation. But that pretty much concludes my thoughts on Dallas versus Shanghai, which means that we have come to the end of this top 5. What games did you enjoy the most in Season 4? And which ones do you think deserve a shout out that I left off on this list? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel for more Overwatch League content like this. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.